this is from Cindy, but it looks like James also has that same question. I was wanting to make a 6-gallon batch of lemon mead, and I've been reading a lot and know now that there are numerous ways to do the same thing. I would like to use Fermentation, not sure about from Go Firm, when to add these and how. I was also thinking about not adding any acid blend. Was planning on adding some lemon juice from fresh squeezed and secondary. Any other ideas would be greatly appreciated. We make one with lime juice. A good recipe to base a lot of stuff out there on the internet is called skeeter pea. The way he does it, so when you add lemon juice in primary, that you're going to get a super big swing downwards in pH, and that's probably going to stress your yeast out. So skeeter pea is made by adding the lemon juice in stages such that you don't overwhelm the yeast. I don't have a graph handy, but yeast go through a growth phase. They spend probably the first 12 to 24 hours assessing the sugar situation and not really consuming the sugar. They start building a colony and they start making flavor profiles. As they start building the colony, about a third of the way through, they're definitely on a linear 1-to-1 scale climb up to where they're going to plateau at some point. I probably wouldn't add any lemon juice prior to that, like a drop. When I talk about a third of the fermentation, if you're looking on your hydrometer, if you start at 1.104 and you're trying to get to 14% alcohol, 104 gravity points is about 14% alcohol. So it would drop from 1.104 down to 1.000. So out of that 104 points, the first 1/3 gravity is about, let's say that's 35 points. So once 1/3 of the sugar is gone, that's probably where I would probably maybe add a third of your total lemon juice that you calculated on, and maybe by 2/3 of the sugar to about 3/4 of the way, I would add the rest of it. If you're going to add it in secondary, don't think there's really any downside to that. It's going to be a whole lot stronger. It's going to be more like fresh lemons. You might have to use less of it. That goes back to using the fruit in primary or secondary, that there's a different animal once the sugar from the fruit is stripped by the yeast. But things like strong citrus character can really make some interesting changes to the flavor profile. Cindy asks, would like to use Fermentation and not sure about Go Firm. I would always use Go Firm to hydrate your yeast. It's going to make for healthier yeast in the bottom line rather than just straight sprinkling on the top and hoping for the best. Your yeast want to rehydrate. Dried yeast is actually, so let me back up. A lot of people, I learned a lot of my chops from home brewing beer. And in beer making, a lot of people use liquid yeast cultures, and they make starters with them. And I found that with dry yeast, it's not really quite as much necessary to make starters. When they freeze dry this stuff, they've basically built the yeast up to where they're almost immediate ready for use, and they freeze dry them at that point. So if you put them into a liquid starter the way you would do like an Erlenmeyer flask and a stir plate, you're actually making them use up the acid, the sterol that they've built up. Basically, before they have a chance to be exposed to the must, they're already starting to use up what reserves they have. So I tended to not make starters. I do use Go Firm. So when you use Go Firm, you're basically kind of making a nutrient soup for them. And I explained a little bit about how to use that. It's like it's either 1.25 or 1.5 times the amount of grams of yeast that you're using for the batch. And again, you kind of just get a small amount of water. The amount of water is not really necessary to dial in, just enough to make this soup, enough to make enough where the yeast can dissolve. You put the Go Firm in, it cools down a little bit over 15 minutes to where, ideally the yeast want to absorb this about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So I start at like about 110, and it cools down about 6 degrees roughly. It's not going to kill the yeast at 104. And let the yeast sit in there for 15 minutes, and then that's why I add the cooler must to the yeast and the Go Firm solution to chill it down just a little bit. When to use Fermate K? So there's a lot of different ways people read about. You read about staggered nutrient additions there's Tosna to use straight Fermate O across the board. Again, I use a mixture. I have my own ratios of Fermate K, DAP, and Fermate O, and I add them in two places. So I do a staggered nutrient addition, but only in two. I do one addition 24 hours after I add the yeast, and then at 1/3 of the way through the sugar break. So whatever my total amount of allocated, I add 1/3, half of my nutrients, 24 hours after I add the yeast, and the other third. It's typically 3 to 7 days. Depends. It really depends on how strong, how much sugar you start with, and so there are rule books out there, but it kind of depends on the situation for me to say when you use those and how. The one thing I will note about adding any of these nutrients to a mead is that if you are not fermenting in a carboy, if you are fermenting in a carboy and not a bucket, be very wary of that second yeast, that second nutrient addition. As fermentation progresses, the yeast kick off CO2, and the CO2 gets entrained into the must. When you add these crystalline powders like diammonium phosphate or DAP and Fermate K and Fermate O, they create nucleation points. And what can happen is it will immediately start foaming, and there is nothing you can do about it. If you have a jug or a carboy that's filled quite full and it's been bubbling for a while, and you add these nutrients or these powders to it, that's where you get a volcano, and you can lose 1/3 to half of your volume, and you will have a giant mess. So you have to kind of degas, and that's something that's not really asked here, and it's a general procedure that I go through just in mead making, and that is that through the first third of fermentation, I actually try to continue adding. First of all, I recommend doing things in buckets, especially if you have a high alcohol mead. I've been doing stuff in buckets for years, and knock on wood, I've never really had any infections from opening this up in the first third of fermentation. If it's a clean, sanitized bucket, if you've pitched the proper amount of yeast, if you've added nutrients already and the yeast are really, really healthy, they're going to outcompete a lot of the things. You see a lot of infections that happen. Most of the infections happen downstream, so after fermentation is done, you find it happen in beer a whole lot because beer has long-chain sugars that yeast may not be able to hit, but souring bugs like Brettanomyces can actually get to and chew up, whereas the yeast won't be able to. Honey doesn't have these long sugars, it has very limited amounts of long chain sugars. It's mostly simple sugars. So the yeast that you have there are the first ones to the feast, and they tend to take care of almost all these problems. To finish up Cindy's question, I was thinking about not adding any acid blend. That's probably a good thing. You probably don't need any acid blend up front. You might, the lemon juice is going to add plenty of citric acid. If you want to add other things like tartaric acid, I mean, you're going to get some acid, you're going to get some gluconic acid from the honey as well. So I would probably add acid to, after fermentation is done, to taste. You might add tannins though. If you look up the Skeeter P recipe that's online, you can see how much tannin he recommends using for a 5-gallon batch. I don't have it here in front of me. I want to say it's like a quarter. I just don't remember. I would be lying if I said I look it up. But it's out there. It's called Skeeter P. And any other ideas would be greatly appreciated. On making strong citrus meads, don't add too much citrus. The fresh squeezed stuff is probably okay. It kind of depends on how strong a flavor profile you're going to. Again, it all comes down to this balance thing. You kind of want to have the honey and the fruit be balanced in the flavor as well as in the aromatics. So you can always add more in secondary, and it just makes it really hard to take it away. And if you add too much, then you can cause yeast stress. So I tend to put in, like, at the very, very end of fermentation, basically in the last 2/3, I'll add lime juice or whatever. Sometimes I'll add it in post, but most of the time I really don't find a need to add it in post. But at that point, you're really not doing much flavor changes. It's the yeast are going to knock the edge off and take a little bit of the sugar out of the citrus juice, and versus how much is going to be. If you're back sweetening, then you're going to be adding sugar to it. So it's kind of not that big of a change putting it at the very end. But the main thing is, don't put it up front with the yeast. You will stress the yeast out. So take a look at the Q&A. Robert asked if we're making tea and lemon concoctions, do we need tannins? I think the tea probably should take care of that. Michael asks, is there any added benefit to using oxygen stone pump instead of stirring the mead and getting oxygen in the must? I would say certainly in the very, very beginning, adding oxygen to it, that you can add, if you have an oxygen stone, you've been making beer, you could probably go the same amount, the same regimen you would for beer, and probably stir it up, let it go for a minute. It's not going to have the krausen or the big foam kind of problems you have with beer, so let it go for about the same amount of time. Is there an added benefit? You're getting straight O2 rather than, air is 80% nitrogen and 20% oxygen, so you'll probably get saturation faster, and you may not have to do pump overs. We do not add oxygen on our commercial scale. We basically stir it heavily until we get like a vortex that sucks in air, and we just do that for a while, and our regimen works pretty well for us. I don't have any scientific numbers on that, so there's no reason not to. It sounds like it'd probably be easier. Mostly degassing is probably more important, is trying to get rid of the CO2, and by heavily mixing. So I make the distinction of in the first 1/3 to, if you start in a bucket and you have one of those Lee's stirrers, which is basically just a stainless steel rod with 2 little wings on it, I take a drill, put it in the bucket, and hit it hard just to make a vortex all the way down where I can see the bottom of the bucket, just quite violent. And after 1/3, between 1/3 and the 2/3 break, I might take it out of the drill and just stick the wand in there and not really try to disturb the surface too much, but I might swing it around quite heavily in the bottom of it. So I call that stirring, but not making a vortex. And that's really just to make it foam up a little bit. When I'm doing the heavy vortex stirring, the first 3 days, like pretty much after the 24 hours after you add the yeast, you won't see a whole lot of foaming, but by day 3 or 4, you will see significant foaming. And I tend to do that vortex until I can start seeing clear liquid and the foam starts subsiding. So that could be anywhere from a minute to 5 minutes of just continuous hard-hitting stirring to degas it and to add oxygen. I've never found a downside to that. In fact, it actually speeds up fermentation by degassing it. The CO2 is kind of toxic for the yeast, and it tends to slow them down. I don't know if it decreases the pH because of carbonic acid. I do notice a drop in pH, but I don't know if it's correlated with the carbonic acid pickup. There could be some other metabolic pathways that are contributing to that I'm not aware of. Let's see. James asked about after fermentation is over and adding the lemon juice, would I use Camden tablets then? And if I need to back sweeten, I'll try to answer more about the Camden tablets. That's potassium metabisulfite. If you want to age your stuff, I recommend using that after fermentation is done, pretty much every time you rack. So if you're asking if you need to back sweeten, not only do you need to use Camden tablets, which is also called potassium metabisulfite, but you need to add sorbates as well to prevent re-fermentation. So there's a difference. Neither one of those things kill yeast. People have this context that potassium metabisulfite or sorbates will kill yeast. Now, to be fair, Camden tablets or potassium metabisulfite will kill yeast at the detriment of making your yeast irreversibly taste like matchsticks. So if you use too much of it, it will kill the yeast, and it will make a completely hostile environment for even palatability that you can't even drink it. If you use the proper dosage, It basically keeps everything at bay. Sorbates are a way of preventing yeast reproduction, so it doesn't kill it. If you add it while your yeast is still cloudy and the yeast is not cleared, you really need to have a fairly low cell count for it to be effective. So you probably, before you back sweeten, so your mead is finished and it's not active anymore and your yeast is starting to drop out. Your yeast will drop out into what we call gross lees, which is the first layer of sediment that drop out once the yeast don't have anything else to do and they start going dormant. Once you rack off of that, your yeast will still be kind of turbid and have some cloudiness to it. It's certainly a better time to use sorbates then. I would probably even wait at least an additional week, crash it cold if you can. That helps precipitate some of the yeast out. Commercially, we actually fine and filter before we add sorbates to get a really low cell count so we know our sorbates are effective, that we don't have re-fermentation. So to answer your question, use Camden tablets, then after fermentation, add sorbates, and then back sweeten. I wouldn't back, you can add them all at the same time, but make sure it's not very cloudy. If it's cloudy and you have a lot of yeast dropping out, a lot of it will drop out to the bottom and you'll rack off of it and you'll lose how effective all that stuff is. Use Camden or the K-Meta powder every time you rack. I think typically you would use, for potassium metabisulfite, about 1/4 teaspoon for 5 gallons every time you rack, because the sulfites get bound up and all the things that drop out of solution, and it kind of goes away. Since potassium metabisulfite, Camden tablets, are an antioxidant when used properly, it doesn't fix oxidation problems, but it keeps it from happening. So that's why it's good to keep up. I find a lot of, sometimes in mead competitions, that I get some of those either sherry notes or the papery cardboard kind of flavor that happens. Mead's pretty hearty to it, but you can tell people that the ones that don't have that raw kind of honey flavor, kind of have that sherry kind of character, they also sometimes carry that cardboardy flavor, and that's often because they've either had airlocks, they've had high headspace in the carboys, or their airlocks have gone dry for a long period of time. Potassium metabisulfite tends to help in that substantially, but you have to keep on top of it. This is versus beer making, where everything's all up front. You put it in cold side, you let it go a couple days, and you package it. This is more like wine making, which is our hot side is really just mixing up stuff, babying it through the cold side, and then we have a long extended aging period that most beers don't go through. So you kind of have to, even though there's not a lot to do over the course of weeks or months, you still have to do something with it and keep on top of it so things don't dry out. So hopefully that answered a fair amount of those questions. Let me check these things one more. Robert asks, I have used 1 Camden tablet to 1 gallon and have no odd taste. Is that too much? I haven't used Camden tablets in a long time, but what I recall, that seems to be the right amount. Usually there's a number on the package. I use some free software for determining sulfite levels. I think it's FirmSoft that has a sulfite calculator. You can get like a little downloadable app, and I think it has Camden tablets on there. And I think I'm all going off memory, and I think that it's 1 gram per one tablet per gallon, but I can't.